Thank you so much, guys, for being here. I'm just going to go ahead and let the speakers introduce themselves. Why don't we start with you, John, and you can talk about your channel. You can basically give us a rundown of what the things that you do. And right after that, we're going to jump with Dr. Boyce.
All right. Well, thank you guys for having me today. I'm so glad that y'all, wanted me to come on here and have this debate. I really appreciate being thought of for this type of debate. Basically, I'm the Godless Engineer. I have a channel here on YouTube. I discuss a whole plethora of topics, mainly surrounding atheism and any arguments against atheism or for theism, for that matter. We also do a Bible study every Tuesday, and we have response videos that post every week to videos that everybody sees around on the internet. And one of the topics I do cover is the historicity of Jesus and the historicity of Christianity in general. So I do that. I also have an app in the app stores called Crestus that you can go and download, and it's got all the information that I'm going to be discussing here tonight. If you want to go and get that and get up to speed on the most current scholarly information on this topic, then you can go and check that out.
All right, Dr. Boyce, will you mind introducing yourself? Anything you want to share with us tonight?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Stephen Boyce. I'm a part of the City Light Network. I work as one of the apologists and researchers on the team, but I'm also part of the local church plant here on this side of the United States in Asheville, North Carolina. One of the main things, I just finished my doctorate, my PhD, focused primarily on canonicity and textual criticism, but every now and then I'll do a debate similar to this. But most of my work is writing on manuscripts or looking at pseudo-apocryphal text or the actual apocryphal text, the Old Testament, or anything really canon, New and Old Testament. I always enjoy a good discussion. I'm excited about the opportunity, John, to engage a discussion with you as well. And it's always a learning opportunity, no matter where you go, no matter how much you know, there's always something out there to learn, and there's always reasons to be challenged. So I think these discussions are good. I think it's good for Christians. I think it's good for atheists. We get to hear each other out. And that's always my encouragement, especially to the audience, is do not tune out. If you're a Christian, do not tune out an atheist speaker who has a position and a reason for that position. Actually hear it out so you know what they're saying before you respond to it. And we hope we can have that on both sides today and get into some of the good discussion about the topic of the historicity of Jesus.
All right, good. So John, somebody has already pointed out that your T-shirt is really funny. So that's really good. I really like it. So I guess that really fits the occasion. Well, if you guys want to get into it, what we can do is Dr. Boyce, why don't you get us started? We'll give you your first 15 minutes, and then after that, we'll let John take his 15 minutes, and we'll have the rebuttals after that. All right, you can start right now if you want to.
Okay.
I'll start your timer whenever you get started.
Yeah, I was going to wait for your time. I didn't know if you're keeping the time over there. Actually, I'm going to set up mine as well, so that way we're covering it. And if I go over, just take it away from my rebuttal. So when we're talking about the existence of a historical figure, the question has to be, how does one trace that figure? Two of the main processes in doing that would be, one, an eyewitness report or reports. Two, where are the written records or an archived record of the eyewitness reports or of the individual and his sayings alone? Today, what I want to do is I want to take two figures who had similarities in history, and we're going to compare them. We're going to compare the eyewitness reports. We're going to compare the written reports. The first one, which is of Socrates of Athens, and then also Jesus of Nazareth, and use these two rules. We're going to try to be consistent with historical data in order to sketch a person as whether they were existing in history or if they were myths. Number one, Socrates. Let's look at the eyewitness report about a guy like him. One of the most famous of his followers was Plato. He was a student of Socrates who wrote extensively about him. Another one, which is a great historian that we benefit from greatly today, is Xenophon. He was a student, also a friend of Socrates, spent many hours in discussions with him. Aristophanes is also another one. He was known as the father of comedy. Now, most of his interaction and discussion about Socrates came from plays. One of his most famous about Socrates was Clouds, which Plato accused him of contributing to a trial that led to his death. In fact, he resented him for this. But these are his eyewitnesses. When we're talking about Socrates, these are his students. There was others as well, which we'll look at in a minute. But they were the ones that were the main go-to guys. Because remember, we're going to talk about this, Socrates did not write down his teachings, just as Jesus of Nazareth did not write down his. This leaves a dilemma. So therefore, when we're talking about Socrates or Jesus, we have to rely on eyewitness accounts and reports. So the main two for Socrates were pretty much Plato and Xenophon. These were the primary. Again, Aristophanes had secondary discussions because most of his were indirect rather than direct writings. There's also a man named Antisthenes, and he was a writer and a follower of Socrates. In fact, there's numerous stories about how he would walk for hours and hours to Athens to go hear Socrates speak, and he would record much of what he said. He was an adamant follower. He was hardcore. But there's another guy who was not so hardcore. Aristippus was not a big fan of Socrates, although he was a disciple and a student of Socrates. He wandered extremely far from the principles and practices of his teachings. He actually started his own sect of teaching off of Socrates and combated Socrates, most of which his daughter and his son, his daughter being the champion, who carried on his arguments after his life. So we see even people that followed Socrates believed in him, but they deviated from his philosophies. But is there more to him? I mean, what else can we look at? We see eyewitness reports. We see records, whether critical of him or positive for him, of his followers and eyewitnesses. There's also second generation records. Aristotle was trained by Plato. And this is what he said about Socrates. Socrates, however, was busying himself with so basically, let me summarize this for the sake of time. He was saying that Socrates had great ideas, but they really weren't succinct. Plato took Socrates' ideas and he made them better, is really what it's coming down to. And so when we look at the history of the Greek times here in Athens, where do we find corroborated witness? Where do we find a historian who compiled data all the way to the time of Socrates, all the way into the time of the Maccabees, including Alexander the Great? Arian of Nicomedia did this. Arian was a student of Epictetus, who was a staunch lover of Socrates. In fact, Arian mentioned that his literature was a lot like the style of Socrates. But keep in mind, how could Arian say that about Socrates if Socrates did not write? Well, pretty simple. It comes down to the basis of he read Plato. He read Xenophon. What did Arian do? He went to the archives. He went to the records. He went to what any historian would do. Remember, Arian was working at the time under Hadrian, the emperor, the time of Rome being in dominance. He's studying any library and record he could get of the Greek times. And this was his habit. His habit was to study close eyewitness accounts. We see this in his research of Ptolemy of Alexander the Great. Where did Arian go to start his understanding of a historical figure? Eyewitness reports. He pulled every record. He pulled everything he could to find it. All right, so we see a guy, Socrates. No writings, only written about, eyewitness reports, secondary accounts, and historians corroborating his testimony. Jesus also had eyewitness reports. If we're going to use Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, he mentioned that the 12 had seen him. Now, particularly this is his resurrection, which we don't need to spend our time emphasizing today, but he was followed by his 12. They were chosen by him. He had a brother named James the Just, which we'll talk about in a little bit more. Paul himself testified that he spoke of Jesus, not just as the resurrection of Jesus, as he did in this chapter, but he was willing to take people to jail, martyr people, and be at the stoning of Stephen in order to see that this Jesus of Nazareth was no longer taught. Remember, the Jews were not arguing the existence of Jesus. They gave him a name and a location. He was Jesus of Nazareth. That's a person from a particular place, because Jesus was a common name. They were identifying. They were rebuking the apostles for speaking in that specific name of a man and that location. Paul did the same thing. He was bringing these allegations against the Christians for teaching that this man that they had killed was still alive and resurrected from the dead. That was the great sin he was persecuting the church for. He also mentions later over 500 witnesses who saw the resurrection, but there would have been many more in the ministry of Jesus who went, heard him, saw him, were healed by him, etc. But so now we look at the archives. So those were the main eyewitnesses, people like the apostles, people like the half-brother of Jesus, Paul, James the Just, Jude, all these different guys have witnessed the eye report of Jesus. Now, whether somebody believes that Matthew wrote his own gospel or not, we have firsthand records from Papias, who was trained by two eyewitnesses of Jesus, Aristion and John the Elder. He reports on this, and he actually continues to tell that he learned a lot from the four daughters of Philip that you see in the book of Acts as well. He records that Matthew had collected a group of sayings of Jesus in Hebrew or possibly Aramaic that were later by other followers and eyewitnesses translated into Greek. There's no dispute about whether the dispute is, did Matthew write it? That's not really the argument I want to make, was the reports done by a firsthand eyewitness? Papias, knowing the eyewitness reports, as much confirmed this. John, also his gospel would have included this as well. He wrote from an inclusio, the same as Mark did, an inclusio eyewitness report. He states a gospel narrative of himself being an eyewitness of the Lord Jesus before, during, and after his death. He also mentions that he, as a representation of a group in his epistle, 1 John, that he touched and seen the physical body of Jesus himself. He was not a myth. He was a physical body. They knew him. They touched him. They spent time with him. He reports that both in his epistle and his gospel. And Paul, of course, at times quoted the teachings of Jesus more often than telling narratives, although he did give certain insight about Jesus's teachings in his life, but he did not deny Jesus as a public figure or a physical being. His greatest sin against the Jews is that he changed his belief that Jesus was more than a man. He was the Son of the living God who resurrected from the dead. So these were the main eyewitness reports that were writing. Just like there were 3 for Socrates, I brought 3 to the equation for Jesus. But there's also second generation records who were talking to those who were eyewitnesses, just as Aristotle did of Socrates, learning from Plato. Mark wrote an eyewitness report that every church father just about that you could think of recorded, that he was acknowledging Peter's sermons in Rome, collecting them and writing down the eyewitness report of Peter. This was reported once more by Papias, also Clement, Justin Martyr, Eusebius, Tertullian, Origen, and others, all affirmed Mark was writing recorded eyewitness testimonies of Peter in Rome. Luke, as a historian, gave 2 written accounts, one of the ministry of Christ and the other of the claims of the New Testament church moving forward. Whether you believe Luke was the writer or not, he was writing from an eyewitness standpoint. His records are consistent with his prologue, mentioning that he interviewed the eyewitnesses and took down firsthand notes. He followed the segments of Mark using the inclusio eyewitness standard, starting with Peter and ending with Peter. And he continued this trend all the way to the example of where he includes himself in the writings of Acts, stating that he spent time in Caesarea with Philip and that he had also spent time with his 4 daughters. Then you have the following secondary sources with that. You have the writings of the Didache, which were influenced end of the 1st century, going into discussions. Polycarp was trained by John the Apostle, an eyewitness. He writes an epistle. Clement of Rome, trained by Peter and Paul. In fact, he's one of the few that gives us the earliest witness of their martyrdoms. Ignatius, Papias. Again, Papias was trained by Ariston, John the Elder, daughters of Philip. Papias spoke of a living voice. The idea of that is literally that the voice of those who were eyewitnesses were still alive and telling stories. In fact, we know Papias, according to Eusebius and others, wrote 5 volumes of collected eyewitness material that he eventually had to that we lost, unfortunately. And what we do know of it, Eusebius has quoted numerous aspects of his 5 volumes. But what we see about all of these is that they have the same base. They have the same document base for quoting the works and ministry and miracles of Jesus. All of them, any of them, at any point in the country. Jerusalem, the West, the East, the North, the South, they're all quoting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Paul's epistles. Every single one of these, because they were trained. This was the standard base. These were the documents. Just like if you want to know what Socrates said, you went to Plato, you went to Xenophon, you had to go to the eyewitnesses' records. Just like Aristippus, who deviated away from the teachings, so did Jesus have people who deviated over time. The Nacenes were a Gnostic sect who claimed to go back to his brother, James the Just, according to Hippolytus of Rome. And in the epistle of Peter to Philip, he identifies a physical body of Jesus. The spirit of Jesus communicated with this body, inhabited him, and then abandoned him on the cross. So we see Jesus has eyewitness reports, multiple secondary reports trained by the eyewitnesses, all using the same base text to talk about this person of Jesus. But that's not it. You also have non-Christian sources dealing with this. You have, unless there be some Jewish bias or Christian Jewish bias or Christian Gentile bias, even the Talmud had to acknowledge a person who they did not like. The Jews did not like Jesus. They spoke of one who came around that time period. Hesekiah reports on Domitian. Now keep in mind, Domitian's at the end of the 1st century, really bringing in the heavy persecution of the Christian church at the end, predominantly when John the Apostle and John the Elder were alive, a time of Papias. He was interviewing and looking to talk to the family of Jesus. In fact, he was looking for distant relatives. Here is Domitian, a Roman official, dealing with the problem of illegal Christianity, and he's trying to get to the bottom of the sources. He goes and he searches for physical relatives of this person, Jesus. He was not looking for a myth. He was looking for a man. Josephus is often disputed in some of his places when dealing with the physical Jesus. I will not use that report since it is disputed, although I think it is accurate. He talks about the death of Festus, and he talks about how the Sanhedrin had brought before them James, the brother of Jesus, who is called James. He was James the Just, who I mentioned earlier, one of the eyewitnesses. They delivered him, and they tried to bring about execution and persecution in the church, and they brought the brother of Jesus. They recognized him as having a physical brother on the earth. Tacitus was a man who recorded Roman Senate material. He mentions on numerous times he had access to the archives from the Senate. He writes this about Jesus, that Nero fastened in guilt and made an exquisitive torture on classes of people, specifically the Christians. He was burning them alive. And he mentions this, that Christus, or Christ, whom his name was the origin, suffered extreme penalty during the time of Tiberius at the hands of one of our prosecutors, Pontius Pilate. And most people excuse Tacitus here and say, well, we don't know if it's Tacitus, and he probably just heard that from the rumors of the Jews. Keep in mind, Tacitus had records of Roman Senate. He was bringing out these accusations. He did not speak on behalf of the Jews. He spoke on behalf of his own government officials, Nero, and one of our prosecutors, Pontius Pilate, our prosecutor. Don't miss that. He's writing as a Roman, not in rumor mill. So then you have another thing here. We have the Acts of Pilate. According to Suetonius, Julius Caesar's first enactment as a leader was to produce documents day by day from the Senate, publishing to the common people decisions and edicts meant in Rome. These Acts of Pilate were confirmed by 3 other sources. First, Maximum II. He was, again, non-Jew, non-Christian, forged memoranda of the Pilate providing evidence of his knowledge of Pilate's records. Justin Martyr did the same things. On 3 times, he makes mention of the acts that were recorded by Pontius Pilate. Tertullian, a Roman citizen and a lawyer, points to Roman records for the confirmation about these facts. He states this about the time of Tiberius, the emperor. They all acknowledge that the Roman officials, if they were going to do any work, were to take in any documentation, whether they were taking a prisoner, releasing a prisoner, or crucifying a prisoner. There would have been documentation. It would have been archived. They knew of the existence of Pilate, and they all mentioned the death of Jesus in it, both through Maximum, Justin Martyr, and Tertullian. Then we have our historian. As we saw a historian like Arian coming around for the Greek times from Socrates, Alexander, we have Eusebius, commissioned by, guess what? A Roman governor, a guy Constantine. Just like Arian, he collected data from the history about 300 years after the life of Jesus. And he makes a report that even after him, fellow historians give him great acclamations for his history, that he was accurate in what he did. And also we see Amara bar Serapion, who wrote to his son, a Syrian, not a Jew, not a Christian, not anybody else in the Roman government. He speaks of 3 martyrdoms that were unfair. The first one that I mentioned was Socrates, and that punishment came from executing these people. For the sake of time, he also mentions the Jews who executed their king, which goes back to the inscription that was given Jesus, the King of the Jews, and that their destruction came, speaking of 70 AD, as a result of killing him. But that their legacy moves on. Socrates' legacy moves on through Plato. And here, the wise king of the Jews, his legacy moves on through the law he laid down, which was reported through his eyewitnesses and their documents. It goes back. If Jesus was a historical figure, we have to deal with this reality. If Jesus was a historical figure and he could be proven by eyewitness and records, just as Socrates, in fact, he has tenfold more evidence of his existence through writings, documents, and the dates of those writings than Socrates did. If Jesus is not historical, we need to eliminate Socrates as historical too, because they follow the same criteria. They follow the same witness to being historical figures.
All right. Well, John, if you're ready, we'll jump right into it, and you can get an extra minute if you need to.
Can I make a quick request though? Like, if anybody's threatening violence in the chat, can we actually time those people out instead of like people that are trying to prevent that? Is that a possibility?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm not looking at the chat.
Thanks, because I felt like it was a little unfair that my wife got timed out for calling out the person that was.
I definitely agree, so I appreciate you giving me a heads up, John. But I was listening to everything and I wasn't fully engaged. But I'll go look.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, please, guys, keep it civil and don't time out somebody if they're not doing anything really, I mean, threaten somebody. I think that's not cool. So if you guys could just keep it chill, respectful. John has been great. He's a great individual. And, so far we have had communications going back and forth. He has been really respectful, and let's keep it that way. Okay, guys? And John, whenever you're ready.
Okay, awesome. Yes. So, am I full screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right. Yeah, I've got my own presentation I'm feeding through my own camera right now. So, all right. So, first off, I want to thank everybody for being here today to take part in this debate. And today I'm going to be presenting my argument for why Jesus probably didn't exist. So, first, what exactly is mythicism? Mythicism is the hypothesis that Jesus did not exist in history. Minimal mythicism stipulates that he was originally a celestial figure who appeared to people after his death and resurrection in the lower heavens or the firmament. There is a lot of evidential support for this hypothesis. This hypothesis also seems to be the most parsimonious explanation for what we find in early Christianity. So today I'm going to be talking about the pre-Christian evidence about Jesus Christ, the origination of the Jewish Christian sect, and finally the extra biblical references to Jesus. So just to let everybody know, this is not supposed to be in response to the opening statement that I just heard. I did take notes, and I will be going over that in the rebuttals or whatnot. So let's start with the rise of Christianity. So since Christianity originally started as a Jewish sect, it's important to understand that there was no standard set of Jewish beliefs. There was a vast landscape of different sects that existed in the first century. Their ideas about their religion differed wildly at times. This is acknowledged by a number of scholars, including James Charles Worth, Petro Pacomi, Eric Gruen, J. Andrew Overman, Robert McLennan, Margaret Williams, Morton Smith, Alan Siegel, Hames Charlesworth, as well as Richard Carrier. One example of these groups would be the Essenes, as revealed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes rejected the temple and understood that the laws of Moses and understood the laws of Moses in completely different ways than the rest of Judaism. Through Philo of Alexandria, we also understand that there was a syncretization going on between Hellenistic ideas and the Jewish religion. In doing this, Philo's logos, an archangel figure in Jewish lore, is described exactly the same way as the figure we would know as Jesus Christ. Philo describes this archangel as being named Jesus, the firstborn son of God, God's agent of creation, his celestial high priest, and who is involved with the cleansing of the world of sin. Philo of Alexandria uses Zechariah 6:11-13 for his archangel logos figure, and it shows that there were groups of Jews that were searching the scriptures for indications of who and what this Messiah/Redeemer figure was supposed to be. So we also have pre-Christian Jewish traditions contained in the Talmud. These traditions would include an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as speaking about the Messiah, a dying and rising Christ, son of Joseph, as quoted by Zechariah 12:10, and this Christ figure would be pierced to death. While the Talmud dates between the 4th and 6th century CE, the Jews wouldn't have invented a Christ with a father named Joseph who dies and is resurrected to be man's redeemer of sins after Christianity arose. This would only invalidate what the Christians were already espousing. If it did arise after Christianity arose, we should expect to see some argument against what the Christians were claiming, but we don't find that. The book of Daniel lays out a timeline that would culminate in the early 30s AD with the coming of this same Messiah figure. So at this point, we have some Jews in the Jewish community that were expecting a suffering, disgraced, and dying Christ figure named Jesus who would resurrect from the dead and absolve mankind of all their sin. This is the great Redeemer described throughout the Jewish scriptures. Now, cue Paul and his Christ figure. Paul was a diaspora Jew who was writing in the 50s CE. He was merging his Jewish ideas with pagan philosophy, literature, and mystery cults, exactly as Philo had done. Paul, as well as Philo, wrote in Greek, which was only taught in pagan schools, and thus would make it highly unlikely that Paul and his theology wouldn't be influenced by pagan traditions. Paul's Christ figure was only ever experienced through visions or hallucinations and by reading the scriptures. Those scriptures, or he lays all of this out in Galatians 1:11-16, Romans 10:14-17, 1 Corinthians 9:1, 1 Corinthians 15:3-15, Romans 16:25-26. Paul ends up describing the Jesus of Christianity exactly as Philo describes his archangel. They were both the firstborn Son of God, which is Romans 8:29, the image of God, 2 Corinthians 4:4, God's agent of creation, 1 Corinthians 10:1-4, and a pre-existent being, Philemon 2:6-8, and 1 Corinthians 10:1-4. Hebrews, while not written by Paul, but at the same time as Paul was writing, describes Jesus as God's high priest and the supreme angel of all the angels. That would be Hebrews 1:8. It's incredibly impossible that Paul and Philo would have independently come up with the same Christ figure. We see both sets of these ideas, Philo's and Paul's, culminating together after the first century. Justin Martyr, in his first apology, calls Jesus the Logos and the firstborn Son of God. All right, if it's true that there was a diverse set of Jewish beliefs in the first century and more than one group had ideas about this Savior figure, then we should expect to find multiple different messiahs arising around the same time. We find exactly that. These Savior figures went by many names, including Messiah, Son of Man, the Righteous One, and the Elect or Chosen One. The Jews, including Paul and Philo, were reading the scriptures and pulling out different ideas about this Messiah figure. One of these Messiah interpretations was a conquering military Messiah. We know this because of Josephus describing the Egyptian Messiah who approached Jerusalem with his army from the Mount of Olives, as scripture foretold, but was defeated. It's very plausible that the failure of a historically existing Messiah to deliver on the supposed military victory swayed Jews to the more spiritual or celestial Messiah interpretations that had already won this eternal victory and provided salvation. The death and resurrection was most probably happened in the firmament or the lower heavens. The Ascension of Isaiah is a first century Christian work that explicitly states that this is what happened. The Ascension of Isaiah was later redacted to include a pocket gospel that places the events on earth. However, the earliest redaction of this document did not include this portion. Jesus' death and resurrection in the celestial realm of the firmament would also match what was being taught in other pagan religions of the time, like the Isis and Osiris cults. If Jesus had existed, why would they have needed to infer information about him from the scriptures? Why couldn't they just refer to what Jesus said or did? Why was it so important to Paul that he separate himself from any historical reference? He could have referenced disciples at some point, but he never indicates anyone as a disciple of Jesus. Only apostles. Apostles were those that had a vision of this Messiah figure and had been revealed the truth through the scriptures. In general, actual historical figures like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and others have historical citations supporting their biographies and descriptions. They do not have vague prophecies that are interpreted to mean that they will come and do something. All right, finally, let's get to the supposed extra-biblical evidence for Jesus. The most popular source is Josephus. There are two references to Jesus in Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews. The first reference is the Testimonium Flavianum. Eusebius's version is the only version we know to exist. All other versions are based on Eusebius's copy. Like the Arabic and Syriac translations, they are both traced back to Eusebius as shown by Alice Wheely. Paul Hopper has shown that Josephus did not write the Testimonium. The verb usage, plot, and structure of the testimonium indicate that a Christian like Eusebius most likely wrote it. Piling on top of this, the testimonium is out of place in Josephus's work. It interrupts the flow or the surrounding text with this oddly great review of Jesus. Simply put, Josephus didn't write this part of his work. Next part is the James reference, which was mentioned in the opening. This is most likely an interpolation, as the important parts of this paragraph seem to be more like marginal notes than anything else. The paragraph is confusing, as it only seems to become reasonable if you take the part referencing Christ out and replace it with some reference to Ben Damnius that's mentioned at the very end of the paragraph. This seems to be the most parsimonious explanation for that paragraph. Josephus clearly never wrote anything about Jesus. Next is Tacitus. He was writing in the 2nd century, and he was writing about Nero and the burning of Rome that occurred in 64 CE. We would totally expect Christians to definitely exist in 64 CE. It's very plausible that the Christ reference is interpolated, but even if we grant that Tacitus originally made the reference to Christians and Christ, it only proves that Christians were in Rome in 64 CE. We totally expect this on minimal mythicism. He most likely got his information from Pliny the Younger, considering they were pen pals. Simply put, Tacitus does not provide an independent reference to a Jesus Christ existing in the 1st century. And here are some other common references. Pliny the Younger. He was writing in the 2nd century and interrogating Christians, so he just shows what 2nd century Christians believed, not an independent historical source. Lucian of Samosata, he was also writing in the 2nd century and only vaguely references what some Christians believed, not an independent historical source. Suetonius wrote about Acrestus, a Jewish instigator that made the Romans mad, not an independent historical source for Jesus Christ, though. Thallus is another one, but he uses fourth-hand information and doesn't even tie any of the events he mentions to Jesus or even to the Palestine area, not a reference at all. Marbar Serapion, also writing in the 2nd century and also only vaguely talks about what Christians believe, not an independent historical source. Simply put, there are no references to this Jesus figure outside the Bible that don't also depend on the Bible for its information. So, to summarize my case, Jesus probably didn't exist. The 1st century Jews were reading the scriptures for information about this supposed Messiah figure. Different groups of Jews came to similar, if not the exact same, interpretations of scriptures concerning the Messiah. Both Jews and Christians attest to the preexistence of this figure known to both groups as Jesus. Paul never cites any historical source concerning Jesus and even separates himself from any historical sourcing. There are no independent external references to Jesus. And so that's why I am not convinced that Jesus actually existed in history. I understand that my opponent has brought up a whole slew of different things, and maybe we can get to that in the responses, but that'll be it for my opening statement. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I know I did. And I guess I will hand it back over to the mods.
Well, right now we're going to go ahead and have rebuttal. And for the rebuttals, we're just gonna go ahead and take a few minutes for those. Dr. Stephen, whenever you are ready, we'll start the time for that. It will be an 8-minute rebuttal. So we'll start whenever you're ready.
You can cut 2 minutes off of mine for the sake of time.
All right, we'll do that. I'll start the time whenever you get started.
All right, appreciate it. I appreciate the presentation, John. Thank you for sharing the information you have. And I think you represented his position well. A couple things to note in the discussion about Jesus as far as Paul's writings went, particularly with him only viewing him as visionary and so forth. He was representing a group not just of himself, but earlier followers. In fact, he placed himself at the very end, saying that he was born out of due season. There was a time that he came into the equation. He was later, but he had also spent time with Peter. He had spent time with James. These are people he knew. He mentioned James distinctly from the other groups because he was the half-brother of Jesus. He was associated with Jesus physically. He had known him. One of the things that was said as well is that the Greek structure of text writing would have only been known to be taught in pagan schools. I'm curious about that because Greek was the Koine Greek side of things was actually the universal language of the day that was predominantly spoken along with Aramaic to the Jews in the time because of the Hellenizing stage after Alexander conquered the really known world. Now, classical Greek was taught in these later institutions that were more hierarchy, which guys, whoever wrote the book of Luke would have probably been very familiar with the writings of Plato and Xenophon. The style of Luke is very different, perhaps, if you would, from the style of, say, John. John's writing was very much common. Koine means common Greek. It was a trade language used universally across the area. They would have known that language. John had a very elementary, in fact, when you learn Greek in your seminary courses and your undergrad, they start you in John's gospel. They don't start you in other places because it's simple Koine Greek, and John used a very condensed, small version. Paul was definitely better in Greek, no doubt. Him and Luke were probably two of the most prestigious in it. They were trained in great wealth of knowledge and information. Definitely, Paul would have been taught with any kind of Hellenizing versions. He would have been trained under the philosophies of the Greeks. He'd have known of the Roman paganism. He had also been taught in the great ways of the Hebrew scriptures. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was trained by Gamaliel. So yes, there's no doubt about that. Going into the historicity side of things, when it comes to the acknowledgement of Jesus on secondary sources, for example, again, Josephus, there is a disputed portion, which I purposely didn't spend time on. I didn't want to get distracted with that. The one on James is not disputed. The constant attack against that, as well as Tacitus, is that it's an interpolation. Well, if it's inserting something that has a different scene or nature to it, then that needs to be proven through a couple of factors. One, the syntactical structure has to be completely different. John had pointed out that the first one of Josephus had dispute because it's out of place and tactically seems to break thought and things like that. That is not the case in the second reference, however. So there, to be an interpolation, there needs to be two constructed foreign ideas brought together and then brought back to normalcy afterward. You don't see that in Josephus's claims there. When we're talking about Eusebius, anything that he records, he would have been similar to that of Arian, as I mentioned in my presentation. He was writing records. He was not writing his own bias or things like that. He was a historian. He was under Constantine. He was writing from the libraries and the archives that were made available for him. That needs to be understood. And speaking so fast, I mentioned that Constantine was a governor. I meant to say emperor earlier, so I correct myself on that. Talking fast is hard. But Constantine was overseeing this. Historians after Eusebius said he wrote an accurate history. So when he's writing, keep in mind, he is writing from archives, written record sources, whether he agreed with them or not. I mean, even Eusebius had something that he found in the libraries that he said, well, this is a letter from Jesus himself. I certainly don't believe it was from Jesus himself. Make sure I'm being heard by everybody in the audience here. I do not believe Jesus wrote a letter, but he knew of one that existed and he just notified. He obviously didn't think much of it either, but he's a historian. He's just saying, hey, there's a writing that I have in my library that says it's from Jesus. He was just recording the data. When it comes to Tacitus, the same thing was made about the interpolation there. Again, he did deal with Pliny. He did write back and forth in correspondence, but as he mentioned in numerous places, he was often recording Senate dialogue. He was a reporter. He had access to the archives. As we've seen, Julius Caesar gave access to everybody, common people. When Barabbas was set free and Jesus was in prison, that would have been a Senate notified decision that would have been put in what we would consider a newspaper. He was giving writings that were exported out into the common man. This wasn't something that was just hidden away and locked into some lock or in some vault somewhere. He had access to the public knowledge. Yes, there were Christians in Rome. Paul was writing about him, but Tacitus was writing as a common knowledge that these Christians are everywhere and they're following the teachings of a man that our governor Pontius Pilate put to death. He is writing on behalf of a Roman official report. During the times of Tiberius, this was him writing an official Roman statement, not, the hearsay of the Jews or just fantasizing on something that Pliny and him had dialogued about. He had records. He had access to the records. He would have read the records. He would have reported the records. Anything that Julius Caesar would have had issued out all of the time of Tiberius was recorded, put into the public knowledge. Anybody had access to it.
Perfect timing there. All right, well, that was great. Whenever John is ready, we'll jump right into the next part of the debate.
All right. Yeah, so keep me apprised of time because I do have a lot of things to go through. Starting from the very beginning, Stephen was talking about eyewitness reports like 1 Corinthians 15 and the 12. It doesn't actually say anything about them being the disciples. It just says ambiguously the 12. That you can't say that he is directly talking about the disciples when we're really not sure who he was talking about. If he was talking about the 12, it's kind of like a question of, well, which 12 is he talking about? Is he talking about the 12 tribes of Israel? Did Jesus appear to the 12 tribes of Israel? It could have been the disciples, but then why wouldn't he say the 12 disciples instead of just the 12? Kind of seems like you would want to actually specify disciples there. And you also mentioned the 500 witnesses, and there's literally nearly no information given in 1 Corinthians 15 in order to know who these 500 witnesses were. There's no way that anybody in the ancient world could have looked up who the 500 witnesses were and asked them about it. And there's actually a really good argument, very plausible argument made in scholarship that says that this is actually an interpolation because it's one common spelling mistake away from just being over the Pentecost. So it most likely originally said that Jesus appeared over the Pentecost, not appeared to 500. And then you talked about James, the brother, and maybe we can have, I don't know, I can't remember if there's a discussion period, but I have a lot of problems with that, mainly in the Greek, because if you look at the Greek text, there's no way to tell if he was talking about a fellow Christian or if he was talking about a blood relative. The words that are used in Koine Greek right there is actually indicative of both. And without any kind of further indication that he was specifically talking about a blood relative, there's no way to be able to assuredly say that he was talking about one or the other. So that particular reference really doesn't help either of our positions. You seem to have claimed that Paul spoke in a way about Jesus that indicated that he actually did exist on earth. One of the things that you talked about was Jesus being given a place of birth, or like Jesus of Nazareth, like a nationality or something like that. But the problem with that is that for one thing, Paul divorces himself from any kind of historical sourcing whatsoever. If you take my argument for, the whole James, the brother of Christ thing, not brother of Christ, but brother of the Lord. So the fact that the scriptures that Paul was reading, as well as Philo was reading, as well as all of the Jewish Christians were reading, actually has a part in it that specifies that Jesus will be from Nazareth. So given that that is already pre-existent in the Jewish ideology, then it seems to me like placing that on Jesus is just something that they pulled from the Old Testament, not something that may have happened in actual history. The apostles, you say that they were eyewitnesses. The apostle doesn't mean eyewitness. Apostles, as far as Paul and the other apostles go, is just somebody who's been given a revelation of Jesus or has been given a vision of Jesus. So that doesn't mean eyewitness. That just means that they had hallucinations. And then you talked a lot about Papias and a whole bunch of like second century sources that I think that you need to go back and reread, like the actual scholarship and all these, because Papias is not trusted by anybody. Not even Bart Ehrman trusts Papias about things. Papias was known to elaborate on stuff. Like, for instance, you mentioned how, I believe it may have been Polycarp was directly trained by a disciple or an apostle, or at least an eyewitness. But nobody was trained by an eyewitness. There was nobody in the ancient world knew any eyewitnesses of Jesus. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit more as we get further into the debate. But essentially, anytime you hear that, oh, this guy says that this guy was taught by an eyewitness, the guy that he's talking about never ever claims to be to have been taught by an eyewitness or to have seen an eyewitness or anything like that. All of these reports are coming from like the 2nd and 3rd century, when there's no way that they could have known an eyewitness to the supposed Jesus. Then he started claiming really weird things about the Gospels, like Mark composed eyewitness reports in order to tell his gospel. That's not true whatsoever. For one thing, Mark never denotes any kind of historical sourcing in his gospel. In fact, none of the Gospels cite anybody as a historical source. The only source that they actually cite are scriptures. That's all that you'll ever be able to find in the Gospels. And then let's see. Oh, you mentioned the Talmud, how the Talmud mentions Jesus. Actually, that particular Jesus existed about 100 years or so before the supposed Jesus of Christianity. He existed under King Jannaeus. It actually specifically says King Jannaeus in the Talmud. I'm a little surprised that you missed that or missed the scholarship that connects all these Jesuses that are mentioned in the Talmud to be the same Jesus under King Jannaeus, who was definitely not the Jesus of Christianity. So I'm not sure why you brought that one up. I actually hadn't heard this Domitian interviewing the family of Jesus. The family of Jesus is never heard of, even after his death. We don't know what in the world happens to them. So I'm not prepared for that one. Maybe you can educate me on that a little bit, but that'll be something I have to look into. And then you go through Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius. One thing I do want to mention is that the James passage in Josephus is actually contested in scholarship. Currently, right now, Richard Carrier has his refutation, or at least his argument for interpolation. There's been one person to respond to it, but Carrier has already did away with that particular response. It really wasn't all that helpful. Paul, let's see, talking about the Paul, the brother of the Lord. Oh yes, so I'm kind of curious. Maybe you can bring this up, but would you consider that speaking Greek and writing Greek were two completely different skill sets in the ancient world? So while the speaking of Greek was the common thing to do, writing of Greek was a lot more uncommon. And you actually thought, huh? 1 minute. Well, got it. So the writing of Greek was actually not all that common. You would have actually had to have gone to a school, a pagan school, in order to learn how to write that kind of Greek. So my argument still stands about how Paul would have been influenced by pagan ideas and that he was syncretizing Hellenistic traditions with the Jewish religion. Let's see, Eusebius is like Arian. And I get the feeling that you consider Eusebius trustworthy. Maybe that's not what you meant, but I think that comparing Eusebius to Arian is not exactly correct. I feel like that's a little insulting to Arian. For one thing, Arian did have direct references to Alexander the Great, where Eusebius doesn't. And then Tacitus and the interpolation, there's a really good argument for that, but maybe we can talk about that later. The Barabbas thing was really kind of unique. And that'll be it for me. And I guess I'll hand it off to Stephen, or I can't remember what the structure is tonight, but that'll be my first rebuttal.
What we're going to do now is go into cross-examination, obviously, and we're going to take about 12 minutes each. So Dr. Stephen is going to question you, John, and then John, you're going to get to question Dr. Stephen after that. And then you both will give your closest statements after that.
You mentioned the 12. You said it doesn't say the 12 disciples, but would you recognize that the 12 is a common name that was known all through the gospel accounts, specifically, especially of the 12 disciples? I mean, Acts refers to them as the 12, even when they even had 11 of them. It still mentions them as the 12. It was a group. It was a name of a group that was dedicated to 12 chosen people. So,
okay. Well, let me ask you, when do you think that the gospel accounts were written?
I think Mark was first. I think Matthew and Luke were similar in time frame. John was last. John would have been around 90 AD. I think that personally, I believe, according to the witness of the fathers of the churches who were started by Paul, started by Peter, and so forth, they all attested to the fact, I know people disagree with this, and that's fine, that Luke was he was a proponent of Paul, and his writings of his gospel account was Paul's, and which is why Paul in his writing said, according to my gospel. They all understood that to be the Gospel of Luke. He quotes his Jesus citations from the Gospel of Luke. He calls that quotation scripture. So Paul would have been seen, even Marcion, who was trying to destroy the Gospel of Luke and Paul's epistles, recognized the fact that Luke was Paul's authorized gospel account. So I would say Luke would have been his go-to.
Okay, well, let me ask the question again, because when were they written? Like, can you give me dates?
The first century. Well, all of them were written by the end of the first century.
Can you give me more specific dates?
Which gospel?
Well, I mean, you listed all of them, so you could give me, just a list of all of them. I mean, I could go through what the scholarship says about it. I just want to know what you actually think about it.
I'm flexible on Luke's gospel. It doesn't bother me if it's before or after 70 AD. I personally think it was before. I think Mark's was before, and I think Matthew's was right around that same time. I think John was around 90. I think they were all first century. Again, I mean, there are scholars that can go one way or the other. I mean, even Bart Ehrman puts them all in the first century. So I would say that they are first century accounts, either half of them before 70 and the other half after, or 3 before 70 and 1 after. I'm okay with Luke being fluctuated.
Okay, I don't know why you're focusing on Luke here so much, but so Mark was written 70 or after, Matthew was written 80 or after. Luke was actually not written until about at least 93 or after, possibly even into the 2nd century. John's gospel was actually definitely 2nd century. So my question to you would be about the whole 12 business, is that even on your own account here, Paul was writing prior to all of the other gospels. They were all reading Paul, obviously. So the authors of those gospels, who were not the title authors, but the authors of those gospels were reading Paul. They read Paul and they interpreted from Paul this 12, and they thought that that was the 12 disciples, because 12 is a magical number in general for religions. So they got this notion of the 12 from Paul. Paul's the originator of this 12. Paul never cites them as being a disciple. What makes you think that that is a reference to them being disciples?
Well, you kept saying, well, why do you keep going back to Luke? Why you come back to Luke? Because Luke was Paul's gospel. That is what the churches all stated about it. That's what they all said.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Sorry, you're questioning me. I'm not questioning you.
He's questioning you, John.
So again, when we're talking about the time here, Paul said, according to my gospel, all the fathers knew that, was talking about Luke. He quotes from Luke's gospel and calls it writings. He had a writing. He didn't say it was from Luke, but he quotes the words of Jesus word for word precisely from Luke's gospel. It's consistent with his usage of it. So he would have been authorizing the work of Luke to be done. Luke was a companion of Paul. He traveled with them in his travels. He ended there with them at his first imprisonment by the end of Acts. There are scholars that do place it later, but not all scholars place it there. And again, this is a dispute amongst Christian scholars as well as atheist scholars. There's a consensus in one corner, there's a consensus in another corner. It's not a settled thing. There's much dispute that's being there. It's being studied out. I mean, you have to deal with the fact that you have the inclusio eyewitness accounts here that was formed in these first century documents. They're very similar to like Lucius did, or even Porphyry did as well. You have these inclusio eyewitness reports. It's a style of writing going back to the very beginning and there. So I would ask you, like, when you're saying, where's the 12 coming from? If this was their group, they were known in all the gospel accounts as being that 12, why would that be a problem for Paul to refer to them as the disciples? And then he mentions Peter on the side, does he not?
He doesn't mention anybody as a disciple. He never indicates anybody as a disciple. He only mentions people as apostles. So unless you can point to me where he specifically uses a word for disciple, then Paul never cites anybody as a disciple.
Well, a disciple just means a student of a teacher, right?
That's why I said a word that's indicative of disciples. The apostle does not mean that. Apostle.
Yeah, well, Jesus had many disciples, but he only had 12 apostles, correct?
No, I think you're mixing up the disciples and apostles. Disciples were the 12 that walked around with him. Apostles were those that came afterwards. Actually, I do believe I think it's in one of the Gospels. Jesus apparently had like 72 apostles that were going around the area. So no, it's the other way around.
Yeah, well, no, there were 70 or 72, depending on the manuscript, that were sent out, but 12 of them were selected as apostles. The disciples were many. He had many disciples. And going back to that account, for example, does Paul not mention Peter as being somebody who he had engaged with and had conversations with?
Yeah, he does. But does Paul ever mention Peter as a disciple?
Sure. I mean, he just mentioned him particularly, specifically, distinct from the rest, does he not?
Well, no, he mentions him as an apostle, but not as a disciple.
I'm sorry that again, they're interchangeably used both in all the gospel accounts. The apostles were a select group who were eyewitnesses from the beginning of the time of John the Baptist up to the time of his death and resurrection. And that's what they did in Acts chapter 1. Were they not doing that in Acts 1 when they were trying to replace Judas Iscariot? They gave criteria for an apostle. In fact, Paul gave a criteria for an apostle. He had to be an eyewitness of the resurrection of Jesus. But their criteria was it not going back to the very eyewitness account of being with Jesus from the time of baptism of John to his death?
Well, I mean, I think that you answered your own question right there, because you said that the criteria was had they had a vision of Jesus, not had they walked with Jesus.
No, they had to be with him at the baptism of John. That's distinctly what they said, not seeing a vision of him with John. These were disciples of John before they were of Jesus. They were transported off.
Okay, well, as far as I know, like Acts, I consider Acts to be historical fiction, so that's not really linked to any kind of history whatsoever. And so when I hear apostle, I think about how Paul defines an apostle. Paul considered himself an apostle, which he never knew Jesus when he walked on earth. So it simply cannot mean that an apostle was somebody that actually was there at the baptism in the river with John and everything like it just simply cannot mean that in the text.
You cannot have, when you're looking at this, for example, with Socrates or Jesus, whichever figure you want to use, nobody's going to follow the teachings of someone who didn't write unless they were with them and reported of them. Correct?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
just like with Socrates, who had Plato and Xenophon and all these others, no one's going to follow this without some sort of transmitted message from somebody. They're not just believing an ideology, they're believing the teachings from a person, correct?
Well, the person would be Paul, and Paul would be getting his information from Jesus through visions. If that were the case, then Paul wouldn't have said in Galatians 1:11, that he did not get his information from anybody on earth. He only got his information from a vision of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, going back into the back time of history here, because I don't think we're getting much in the disciple apostle discussion. Going back to the history of understanding the sources, you have eyewitnesses. Would you say that there are far more documents containing and surrounding the existence of a person of Jesus than a Greek leader named Socrates?
Well, it's very important to distinguish here, because what we're looking for, as far from a historical point of view, are independent references to Jesus, and not sources that are dependent upon other sources. If I have one source and then I have another source, but the other source got its information from the first source, then I don't have two sources. I just have one source. And it's the earliest source, the one that's independent of the others. So the only independent source that we actually have, if you can consider it independent, is Paul's source.
But did Socrates write, or did people write what he said?
I'm not here to debate Socrates. I'm here to debate Jesus.
But if we're following the rules of history for historical figures, Socrates and Jesus are in the same position. They were teachers in a place. They were both killed. They both had followers. They both had recorded statements about him. They both transmitted that to their followers, and they had historians writing about both of them. They're in the same boat. If we use the criteria of history, eyewitness reports, whether using the inclusia eyewitness reports of Mark or John, or you're going through Paul, whether you put him in there, you had eyewitness reports testifying, passing it on to teachings. You said, for example, Papias is not reliable. Yet I've taken courses from Bart Ehrman's teachings, and yet he uses Papias as a starting point. Would you say that Papias is unreliable based on just the fact, what would be because we don't have the full 5 volumes? Where are you saying Papias is not reliable at all?
Well, primarily because he regularly inflates his reports. A good book to read about this is Bart Ehrman's, I believe it's Jesus Interrupted, or maybe Misquoting Jesus. I can't remember which one it is, but in it, Bart Ehrman relays that, Papias regularly embellishes all of his stories. Like, for instance, Papias once said that Judas, after betraying Jesus, he ended up bloating up to the width of a street and then exploding. That's just one particular instance that Bart Ehrman in his book mentions. But as far as Bart Ehrman using Papias for some kind of historical thing, I would say that that's kind of contradictory to what he actually says in his books. So I'd have to look into Bart Ehrman using Papias as a starting point as far as using him as a historical source.
But Papias, because when guys like Bart Ehrman have guys in history that they see as reliable or not reliable, they don't dismiss everything they say. Just like if there's bad historians, there's good historians. We don't dismiss everything they say. And with Papias specifically, he speaks of talking with 2 guys who were with Jesus of that 70 you were talking about. And that was John the Elder, who is also confirmed again by others like Eusebius that he was buried in Ephesus and that you go to his tomb. And Aristion was one of the other of those 70 as well. Papias had spent time with them. 4 daughters of Philip came to him in Hierapolis and spent time discussing the ministry and work of Jesus as well.
Okay. So that will be the 12 minutes for you, Dr. Stephen, or Dr. Boyce. And then John can go ahead and ask you any questions that he has, and he'll have a little bit over 12 minutes, maybe like 12 and a half or something like that. And basically what I will do is if John asks a question, if he has a thought after his time is over, he can go ahead and basically articulate whatever he has to say. So John, your time starts whenever you start asking the first question.
Okay, so the one thing that I remember that I specifically cited to, discuss was the Greek of the 1 Corinthians, or not Corinthians, sorry, 1 Galatians 19, where Paul calls James the brother of the Lord. I'm not sure how well versed you are in Greek. Is there any way that you could tell me your thought process behind going with the blood relative versus the kinship, like the fictive kinship definition?
Most of my work in my seminary has been in Greek. What verse are we talking about?
First, I can't remember. 1 Galatians 19. Sorry, Galatians 1:19. Yeah.
Adelphon. You're talking about the term adelphon in Greek?
Yes.
Yes. Again, it goes back to the word adelphon has two indications, and context usually helps with that. One, it could mean somebody you were a part of, close to. It could be a nationality. I mean, it's used in the New Testament frequently as a brother Paul, like they talked about brother Paul. He could be seen as an adelphon or adelphos, depending on the usage of the noun. So it could be used as a blood relative. It could be used as a national relative or somebody of close intimacy. James had been established as somebody already named as being the brother of Jesus, along with a couple of others, Simon, Jude, and then he had sisters that were not mentioned by name. So again, if anybody is a part of the teachings, and remember, it wasn't just written, they had oral traditions circulating as well. So when he's talking about James and setting him apart and that he spent time with them, he's going back to the same arena of Acts 15 as far as like a timeline goes. So he would have been referring to that time, but he would have seen him as probably a blood relative. It would have made no sense unless he was like addressing them like, brothers, I'm writing to you this. Paul did that as well. And he was obviously not saying I'm related to all of you, but that he pulled one guy out of the whole group and gave him that term would typically indicate he was talking about a blood relative.
So I'm kind of curious, where do you think that James was already established as being a brother of Jesus?
Again, the gospel accounts, but the gospel accounts were not just written.
No, but no. See, Paul was writing before the gospel accounts were being written, so it's actually Paul that's the first one to proclaim "brother of the Lord" as far as James goes. But also, "brother of the Lord" is only used one other time, and that time it's just as different. Now, in that other reference to a brothers of the Lord in Paul's work, he also uses the exact same word to reference these sisters. But these sisters were actually the wives of the apostles. So do you think that the apostles were engaging in incest in the first century, or do you think that they were fictive kinships?
No, again, but you're misunderstanding the fact that the written accounts were not the origin of things. The current events had already taken place. The teachings, the people that were amongst Jesus, they were already teaching the message of Jesus far before the written text ever came. They didn't just show up on the scene for the first time ever. These were they already knew the brother of the Lord. They knew the writings of Paul, yes, but they also had their family members with them. They had the apostles with them. They had Cephas with them, as called Peter. These people were already circulating a message far before Paul was even writing. So there is an oral tradition before a written tradition. It's not that these people are oblivious to these terms like, well, where did these come from? Well, Paul created them. No, the real life events had already taken place in the world.
Okay, well, I see, I'm not talking about the oral traditions. I'm just talking about what's actually written. And so if we could just stick to like what's actually being written down, because
James
we can't know what the oral traditions were. We can't know what
James
they said.
is a leader in the church. There's a lot of history about James as being the bishop or overseer.
Well, the James that's in Galatians 1 is different from the James that's in Galatians 2. The James that's in Galatians 2 is an apostle. The James that's in Galatians 1 is not an apostle.
Well, that's the importance of understanding first century writings, because so many people have the same exact name. There was always an attachment to distinguish different people. If you have a writer who's referring to a person, they'll say James, the brother of John, or James. Like if you go to Acts, for example, when James is executed, he is distinguished from the James later in Acts because he is called James, the brother of John, because James was a common name. I mean, names were not as variety as they are in our world today. Same thing with Jesus. Jesus was a very common name in the timeline. That's why there was direct correlations to him being a teacher from this or a rabbi or from Nazareth. These were all attachments to distinguish. So when Paul's talking about James, the brother who was killed, like you're talking about the three, you had those three main guys. You had James, John, and Peter. They were the ones that were on the mount and so forth. Yeah, there's a distinguishing difference made by the different James. I don't think they're the same James in those two chapters. Of course, he's distinguishing them by saying James, a brother of the Lord. He's letting you know he has a particular man in mind that is different from the other James. There's no doubt about that. That's exactly why he used the phrasing that he did.
Well, yes, I would agree that it's very plainly that James is very distinct from the James that's mentioned later in Galatians, as well as very different from Cephas, who's mentioned along with James, because in that particular that place in Galatians 1:19, he's actually separating this James from an apostle and saying that he was just a general Christian rather than an apostle, which would have been on a much higher, like I guess, pedestal as far as in the Christian community than just a regular Christian. I mean, would you at least agree that the familial terms used at this time were very convoluted with blood kinship?
Well, when you're talking about James, for example, I guess I'm confused about what you're getting at with him being called the Adelphos here. I hope you don't think I'm saying that both Jameses and Galatians are the same. I do think there's distinguishing differences between them. I don't think they're the same man. I guess I'm misunderstanding where you're going with that. I don't believe they're the same.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I was just pointing out how he definitely is differentiating the two James, but and even differentiating James from Cephas. But the general assumption I get from apologists is that the differing thing was that James was a literal blood brother, but just given the text, we're not given that kind of indication. We're not being told that he is the blood brother of Jesus. We're told that he's a brother of the Lord, which seems more or less like a fictive kinship, because Jesus had to die and then resurrect in order to become the Lord. So I mean, it seems to me like the grammar and the words that are used there are more indicative of a fictive kinship rather than a blood relationship. And all that I hear you saying is you're just speculating that there was some kind of tradition that went around before that had already established James as the brother of Jesus, and that they all knew it, and so they didn't feel the need to indicate it in their writings.
But James, the brother of Jesus, was never seen as apostle by anybody. He was distinguished from the apostles. He was seen as a leader in the church that was separated from the apostles. And again, if you're looking at what he's making an argument for in Galatians chapter 1, he's saying, I did go up to Jerusalem to those who were the apostles before me. He was recognizing that there were people who were sent by Jesus before him. He was not the originator of this. There were others. He went and met with them on his way away into Arabia, and then he returned to Damascus. And after 3 years, he visited Cephas and remained with him for 15 days. And then he saw none of the other apostles except. So here's the thing. What is Paul saying? I went back to the eyewitnesses. He's making an argument. Nope. I went back to the eyewitnesses. Yes, because he needed to know. He didn't have the full story. He didn't have the full scope. He's still in training. He's still learning about who this Jesus is. Why else would he go back and care what the apostles said? If he was the independent source, why does he care what Peter says? Why would he go back to Jerusalem and consult with the apostles and James? If he didn't need their information, he would have disregarded them. If he was the originator, they should have been coming to him. The fact that he went to them is because he needed their eyewitness report. And again, he used James as he did in Acts 15. And again, there's disputes about this, but if Luke was authorizing both those readings of Luke and Acts, as he includes himself in Acts, Paul had overseen these works. He would have been using the material he had knowledge of in both overseeing a writer like Luke as a historian and over his own epistles for himself. So there's no differences there. He actually agrees with what happened at the Council of Jerusalem, and that James was one that rose up above the others as a leader in the first ever established church that came out of Jerusalem. Naturally, he's going to go to James and refer to him as somebody who is a part of who Jesus was. What else would brother mean there if it did not mean what he is saying? Again, adelphos does mean blood brother. It can mean a brother like a Jewish brethren, but that's not how he's using it. He's not addressing an audience of men and women. You talked about how they use that word to address men and women. That would be in the plural. He's not using the plural. He's using a singular here.
No. The same root word is used in both the feminine and the masculine version. And so it's not that he was referring to men. And hold on, I'm talking. He's not referring to like men and women all together. He uses the same root word when he's talking about a sister of the Lord or a sister in Christ, as well as a brother of the Lord. But you're still not giving me any kind of indication in that passage of how it strictly only means a blood relative, when Paul regularly uses that word all throughout his epistles to reference people that are not literally his brother, or that were not brothers in the sense of being a blood brother. So you would need some kind of indication there that differentiates between the two usages. But I just simply don't see any kind of argument that you're giving me.
You can't make an argument of Greek terminology from root words. We'd be here jumping all over the world. A root word means nothing. It's the establishment of how he builds on the root word. A Greek root word has many facets to it. He specifically used here an accusative noun, which shows possession. It is the brother of the Lord. It is the brother that he's possessed. It's a possession here. He's particularly used it in the formation that he did, not as a general term. You're trying to make an argument that Paul was using a general term from the root when he used a specific term of possession. And that is a flaw if you're using that as a Greek argument.
No. I did not make the argument that you're saying that I made. I made the argument that the literal word that's on the page means both blood and kin. And the literal word that's on the page in the feminine form is also used to describe women as sisters in the Lord, or sisters of Christ, or female Christians. So that's the actual argument I was making. No need to straw man me or something like that.
I'm not.
But also another thing, hold on. This is my time to question you. Another thing that you said is that Paul felt like he needed to go to Jerusalem and consult eyewitnesses. And that doesn't make sense. Huh?
One more question.
Yeah, talking about questions.
We went over time, but go ahead.
Right. So my question is that if Paul was going there to consult eyewitnesses because he didn't know, everything that he was supposed to be teaching or whatnot, why earlier in Galatians 1 did he say that he did not get his information from any person on earth? And then why in Galatians 2 did he confess that he didn't receive any new information from the other apostles when he went to consult them about the gospel he was teaching? He didn't gain any new information from anybody else. It seems contradictory what you're saying versus what the text literally says on the page.
Is that a question?
Yes. Why? It's contradictory. Why do you think that Paul mentions that he?
Because he was not convinced about who Jesus was from the apostles. He wasn't a convert of the apostles. It wasn't their testimony that convinced him that Jesus from the dead. He was going after these guys. He had 7 of them pursued after, including killing one of the 7 that were there in Jerusalem, Stephen. He was there collecting the coats of those who martyred him, and he was commissioned by the high priest himself to trail into Damascus to go bring into captivity men and women, those that taught this Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. He wasn't bringing people into prison as a persecutor of the church based on a mythological being, and he was not converted by the testimony of the apostles. He did not care what they had to say. He was ready to imprison them and kill them if it were up to him, he would have. That was his goal. He was imprisoning men and women. He was not converted by the apostles. He did not have a conversion from them. His conversion was from direct revelation from Jesus himself. So he would not need anybody else to convince him about who Jesus was. They could not have convinced him about who Jesus was. He sat there and listened to an entire sermon of Stephen at his stoning, heard the full presentation of Jesus from the time of the Exodus all the way to the time of their day. He didn't care what Stephen's message was about this Jesus of Nazareth guy. They killed him. They put him away. They didn't care. He was determined to deal with the purity so that the temple could still be worshiped in. His conversion was on the road of Damascus, direct revelation from Jesus, not sent by like, for example, the apostles see many people saved in their eye testimony witness in Acts 2, Acts 3, or their message that portrayed. Paul was not one of those converts. It was direct revelation. And he was trained, and that's the point that he was making. He disappeared and had direct revelation from Jesus and trained by him. He did not need them to define the gospel. He had learned the gospel from Jesus himself. He did not say he didn't need to know anything about the history from them. He said he didn't need to know what the gospel was from them. He had already had that foundation established by direct revelation. That's what he's saying here. He's not saying he didn't learn anything from them. He was talking about particularly about the gospel message, about the person of Christ and who he was.
All right, John, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, yeah, I do. Just that that everything that he just said is contradictory to the words that are on the page. I don't care what Paul did before his conversion. I only care about what Paul writes down in his epistles after his conversion. And so to mention that, for one, is kind of misleading. It's sort of a red herring. And then for two, to say that, you know, to make it out like I was making an argument that Paul was convinced by the apostles when that's not even what I said, I think is a bit dubious. And in fact, what he said is contradictory to what Paul says in Galatians 2 about not gaining any kind of new information from the apostles that he did talk to in Jerusalem the second time. So I just don't know how to argue against just misrepresentations like that.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and jump to the closing statements from both of you guys. And for this one, I just basically had Dr. Boyce go first again. I guess I had him go first for everything. And he's going to share his closing statements. And then, John, you can share your closing statements. It will be 8 minutes for both of you guys. And then right after that, we'll jump right into the questions. And Eric will be the one who will be taking over for that. So thank you, gentlemen. And Dr. Boyce, whenever you're ready.
So when we're talking about, once more, the history of a person or a sketch of a person in history, the criteria has to be met. There has to be eyewitness accounts. There has to be written documentation. There has to be archived accounts within that. When we're sketching it out, whether it's Jesus Christ of Nazareth or Socrates of Athens, whoever it may be, there has to be a record of this individual, his teachings. We have far earlier records of Jesus and his ministry than we do of even historical figures like Socrates. The history is obviously and always dismissed. The records are always dismissed. What we have here is we have eyewitness reports, whether it's Papias learning from eyewitnesses. He's not seen as reliable. The churches were started by the apostles. They wrote about this. You have historians writing about this. You have lawyers like Tertullian writing about this. John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, which most people do not dispute, went down into Egypt, started churches in Egypt. His followers, whether you're talking about Alexander, when you're talking about these others that went down and became bishops of the same churches that he started, are carrying the stories of how these things happen that are consistent. The one thing that has to be remained, whether you're talking about second century documents, whether it's Papias, whether you're talking about those that reported of it, of Irenaeus or Tertullian, whether you're going through First Clement, the end of the first century, the Didache, whoever you're quoting, they're only quoting 4 sources about Jesus. 4. They do not quote any of the second century diversions that went on and falling outs with the Nacenes or the Cerinthians or any of their documentation in the Gnostic text, or even following into Marcion's heresies. For example, they refuted him and said that they were perverting. They were comparing the text that they had received at the churches. These were quoting the same 4 gospels every single time. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Every time they quoted 4 gospels. They quoted Paul. They quoted Peter. They were very fond of Peter's writings in First Peter, especially Polycarp. Polycarp wrote often and quoted often First Peter. Quoted First Peter more than anybody. Clement of Rome was quoting through Paul's epistles, Matthew multiple times. The Didache, a first century writing, quotes over 25 times the writings of Matthew. He had a written record similar to the Greek. Most of my dissertation was working through the Codex H that Clement was quoting from, looking at the Greek structure and comparing it to our manuscripts, whether it would be our Nestle-Aland 28th edition text or the Byzantine text, and seeing how close were their citations of the scripture to the actual manuscripts of that time and after that time. And they were quoting the same four gospels with the same wording. Yes, there were textual variances. They dealt with them just like we have to deal with them. But all of the readings they came up with are found in our critical apparatuses of the Greek New Testament. What was their base? They were quoting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the historicity. What's the base that people were going to when you're dealing with a guy like Socrates, Xenophon, and Plato? Why? Because they were the ones who wrote his words and carried on his teachings. They were eyewitnesses. You have the initiation of these gospel texts. Whether somebody believes Luke wrote them or not, whether they believe it was written in 90 AD or 60 AD, you still have inclusio eyewitness usages. Same structure you find in Lucius' writing. You see it in Porphyry's writings. It's the same layout of eyewitness inclusio. It was intentional. It wasn't some guy in the barn sitting down and writing an account. It was strategic. It was Greek structured. They were trained in the languages and they were trained in the materials. And Eusebius, being called just a bad historian almost, or seen as insulting Arian, Eusebius was commissioned by Constantine. He was given the archives of Roman record, Caesarean record, biblical record, non-biblical record, church record, heretical records. He was given access. Even those that were not followers of Jesus by any means in the Roman Empire after him followed his Eusebius's history and said, it is accurate. He was a historian. He reported what he had. He even reported things that were negative towards the scripture. He dismissed some of the ideologies that some Christian churches still hold to today. He dismissed even places, Papias, believing that the 1,000 years was literal. He's like, man, the dude's wrong. That's not literal. That was meant to be an allegory. That was meant to represent something. He was critical of some of the followers early on in the teachings of Jesus and how they went too far with things. He was not writing a biased report. He was just reporting the news from all of the data he received. It was approved by Roman governments, not just Christian sects. It was approved by Roman officials and Roman historians after him. It is equal to it in the sense of being a historian. He was a phenomenal historian. So when we look at all these evidences, you have far more. And really, when you look at guys like Socrates, for example, we don't have the first manuscript of Xenophon until almost 1,500 years after the original writings. Whereas when we're looking at the New Testament, we have manuscripts from the 2nd century, large copies of John, large copies of Luke in the end of the 2nd into the 3rd century, and full ones by the 4th century. Early within the original writings, you have these early testaments. We don't have to worry about giant gaps of 1,500 years of these accounts the same way that they do. If John is 2nd century and all these other 2nd century, we have a lot of explaining to do how 1st century fathers are quoting these gospel accounts and wording them the same way. Either it was oral tradition that was passed on and written later, or it was actual written documentation that was circulated in the churches. The churches were aware of their apostles. They're aware of who started and formed them. They were not running around with farmers and pitchforks who knew nothing. They recognized that there had to be evidence. They recognized there had to be documents, and they had to be precisely given to them by authorities who had the right to give it. 1st century writing was very protected. Even Marcion, the minute he went off and started deviating away from the original text that these churches held, they called him out, they rebuked him, they wrote entire works against him. Same thing happened all the way into the time of Jerome. Even Jerome was being plagiarized and fixed on the other side of the Dead Sea. People recognized his commentary of Psalms as being corrupted. The communities had comparisons. They had documents. They had eyewitness accounts. They all recommended them as eyewitness accounts. They use them as eyewitness accounts. And they all, across the world, not one nation, across the world, use the same 4 gospels as their record of eyewitness accounts of Jesus. And they confirmed it through Paul. And they spoke very much about this issue and all that they had received from the apostles from the original states. There were people who spoke of these figures, like, again, Papias can be dismissed, but he knew Aristion, he knew John the Elder, he knew the 4 daughters of Philip, he had conversations with them, he reported what they said, and what we have of it is recorded in Eusebius. This is a historical argument, and if we're using historical criteria, he fits the same description and much, much more than a historical figure like Socrates. He fits the description of eyewitness reports as well as critical analysis of historians later. He had other documents referencing him. Domitian's looking for his family, recorded by Eusebius. You have government officials like Tacitus who had records of the sentence in the archives, all talking about a guy who existed. Did they believe he resurrected from the dead and he was the Son of God? No. They did not deny he was a real being who existed, was murdered and killed by Pontius Pilate, and it cost the Roman government these influxes that came into the Christian church.
All right, perfect. That was right under the time. So let's see right here really quick. John, you can get your 8 minutes whenever you get started. And then we'll jump right into the Q&A. And for all of you guys who have any questions, if you don't know, just go ahead and you don't have to tag me. You can just tag Eric, and he has been pretty active on the chat. So you guys will know what his handle is. And thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate it. John, whenever you are ready, we'll get started.
Okay. Basically, what I find in this entire debate is just a failure in basic historiography. Because as far as basic historiography goes, and sourcing materials, it's very important to know when things were being written. When was Paul writing? Paul was writing between 50 and 65 CE. When were the Gospels written? They were written after 70 CE. So when somebody, along with Stephen Boyce here, says that, that the Gospels were written at the same time as Paul, or even maybe before Paul, or that Luke was basically taken into account directly from Paul, and that Luke is Paul's gospel. I feel like there's just a basic failure in historiography here, because Paul writing in the 50s and already being very prominent by that time in the Christian community, he influenced the Gospels and their writings. When somebody says that the four Gospels are independent accounts, or that they independently verified the information, you need to ask questions like, well, if that's the case, why does both Matthew and Luke copy Paul, sometimes verbatim? If they were actually recording the eyewitness testimonies of things, they wouldn't have been just copying Mark's gospel. And as far as John's gospel goes, he was writing in response to Luke. So he already had Luke's gospel, as well as Matthew's gospel, as well as Mark's gospel. And this is all very well known in the scholarship. You just got to look for the scholarship on, what were the sources for the Gospels. And the sources for the Gospels are not historical sources. They're just the other Gospels and the scriptures in the Old Testament. So what you need to understand is that the important thing is independent testimony. Independent testimony of Jesus actually walking the earth. And we just simply don't find that in history. We don't find that with Paul, and we certainly don't find that with the Gospels. Paul's gospel only attests to a celestial Jesus. He only attests to having visions and hallucinations of Jesus, as well as reading the scriptures. And he divorces himself completely from any historical source that he could ever hope to have, by saying that he doesn't get his information from any man on earth, that he only gets it from visions and scriptures. That's directly in Galatians. Also, what's in Galatians is him saying that the other apostles didn't give him any more information than he already had. He didn't learn anything from the other apostles because he had been given all of the information directly from Jesus himself. So it was a testimony to his status as an apostle, with the fact that he got his information from Jesus directly, and his information matches with what the other apostles are saying. So there's really no reason to question whether or not, he's really an apostle. But like I said, I feel like the entire debate tonight could be summed up with just a failure in basic historiography, a failure in determining what sources influenced other sources, and a failure in knowing when these people were writing and what their influences were. Because the only independent accounts that we have of this Jesus figure is Paul. everything that we know about Jesus stems from Paul. And like I said, this is all the information that I've been giving you tonight is well known, not only in the scholarship, but just in general in historiography. So I don't know. I appreciate Stephen coming on here, having this discussion with me. I really appreciate him, taking the time out of his day to have this debate. But I guess I just fundamentally disagree with everything that he said in this debate. And I think that's about all the time I need.
All right, John, before we go into Q&A, I would like to ask one question. And how we're going to do this is, if somebody asks a question for you or Dr. Boyce, you guys will get a chance to give your thoughts after the response of the individual, after, the person has already addressed the question. John, I would like to ask you one question, and that will have to be, do you think that Socrates was a historical figure? And if he was, what is the difference between the documents that we have between Socrates and Jesus?
Well, I mean, I didn't come prepared to talk about the historical reliability of Socrates, but if you do want to know what the historical references for Socrates are, then I've got that in my Crestus app that's available on both of the app stores that iOS and Android. But I can speak to a comparison between Jesus and other historical figures. Other historical figures have real historical references to them. They have historical citations. Jesus does not. All Jesus has, as far as independent attestations go, is Paul, and he only ever describes him as a hallucination or vision, and he also describes reading the scriptures. We don't find that kind of evidence for any other historical figure in history, as far as questioning whether or not they existed. So for any historical figure that you can think of in the past, they have real historical citations for them. And it's all contained in my app if you want to know more.
Well, I guess since we're talking about hallucinations, John, thank you for your presentation. Same with you, Dr. Boyce. There's been a few questions. They're kind of all geared towards John or Godless. Do you want me to call you John or Godless? Do you care?
Either one works for me.
Okay, so it's kind of like the disciple and the apostle thing. Just John and
No, I mean, you can call me John. That's fine.
Okay. All right, cool. So going on the hallucination thing, one question came in and they wanted to know what's the evidence that you have for these hallucinations? And if I were to add to that, you did bring up scripture references, or what we would consider Christian scripture references that you obviously don't hold to, but you used it against us. So I'm guessing that I could use 1 Corinthians 15 when Paul's talking about the resurrection, and Jesus showed himself to more than 500 people. If we're talking about hallucinations, are you then purporting that 500 people had a mass hallucination as well?
No, actually, my argument against the 500 was that it's actually an interpolation, and it actually means over the Pentecost rather than to 500 people. But even still, if it literally means 500 people, and that was what was originally written, we're not given any kind of information about them. But also, there are recorded group hallucinations. With the information that we're given in 1 Corinthians 15, you can't really determine what kind of hallucinations they were having, whether they were having all the exact kind of hallucination, or if they were having, somewhat different hallucinations in that group of 500. We're never going to know. Then there's not enough information to actually even speculate on what could have happened. But as far as the references that show that he was having these visions or hallucinations, I'll read Galatians 1:11 and I believe 1:12. So Galatians 1:11 and 1:12 says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ." So I'm using hallucination, revelation of Jesus. Either way you go about it, it's the exact same phenomenon that's happening. The revelations of Jesus are just things that are happening in that person's mind. I believe even that's attested to in Acts, which I don't consider to be historical, but even there, it has Paul cowering on the ground to Jesus, and all of this is only happening in his head. So as far as natural explanations being far more likely than miraculous ones, I would say that having a vision or hallucination is far more likely than an actual revelation of Jesus.
Okay, and Dr.
Yeah,
Boyce, do you have anything to add?
yet Paul uses the word vision all the time, and he separated the term here for apocalypsis in Greek, which is revelation, which means to be unveiled, something's to be revealed. He distinguishes using the word here as he does in other places, like 1 Corinthians 15 or 2 Corinthians, for example. He talks about visions he received. Those are the terms that would be closer to what John is using, not the word apocalypsis. That's not used. In fact, that would be a more direct term for actual understanding and physical revelation, something that was masked and brought forward. It's used all the time for literature, for example. But when it comes to the 500, again, a lot of interpolation accusations come into this, yet there are 0 manuscripts in the Greek, and I just looked at the apparatus, that has that reading that will require that misspelling, 0. Whether that's talking about those that go into the Byzantium area, whether you're in Alexandria, earliest portions of the Latin, none of them have it that way. It's just an assumption.
All right, I guess we'll move on to question 2. Question 2 then would be to you, John. The crucifixion is paramount to the historical Jesus. The TF and the blood amulet mentions this event and figure name the figure as Jesus Christ. Do you reject the historicity of those two, and why?
So maybe if the person could not derogatorily refer to me when he makes that question, I will then answer it. But until that point, I will not answer his question.
What was the question?
So the question was the crucifixion is paramount to historical Jesus. The TF and the blood amulet mentions his event and figure name the figure as Jesus Christ. Do you reject the historicity, or why? I don't have the names of who. I didn't copy their names. I just copied the questions. So that's what I have. So here's the next question then.
Again, there's outside of Christian writing, as I stated, Suetonius recorded the fact that Julius Caesar had established day-to-day archives that were sent out, like what we would call a newspaper, of published documentation of jurisdiction changes, tax changes, all of that was listed out. Both Maximum II, Justin Martyr, and a Roman lawyer named Tertullian, who actually deviated from some of the areas of Jesus, he recorded on multiple occasions that in these writings of the Acts of Pilate, that there was a document, and not to be confused with probably what's called the Acts of Pilate that's today, or Barnabas or anything like that. It's a different document. We're talking about an official Roman document, not a Christianized one. They often, all three of them, had mentioned Pilate had provided documentation of Senate decisions that he had made on a regular basis as being a part of the jurisdiction of Jerusalem. And all of them had recorded through their historicity that Jesus was a historical figure who was crucified, reported through Tiberius by Pontius Pilate, which is consistent with what Tacitus said later. He probably would have received that from the same documentation, if not additional documentation from the Senate reports that he would have had access to, that he made mention of numerous times he had access to. This was public news. I mean, it wasn't just Jewish news or anything like that. There were documentations of all these things taking place. And the Acts of Pilate was established by multiple people in history, both Christian, non-Christian, Jewish, and Roman.
The Acts of Pilate is not a actual historical document. There was no Acts of Pilate, and to everything that Stephen just said is all speculation. There's no hard evidence of these records that mention Jesus being crucified under Pilate or anything like that. It's just pure speculation.
There's 3 sources independent that mention it. Maximum has no basis of creating that out of nowhere. He's a Roman. Justin Martyr was a Christian, yes, but Tertullian was a lawyer who worked within courts systems of the Roman. He was a lawyer. He was pointing to Roman records as confirmation of this. It's not speculation. You have corroborating witness of this. You have multiple sources that are independent of each other who didn't even know each other, stating that the same thing happened. And we know Julius Caesar did this. Suetonius reported it.
Well, so I mean, you would have to then say that, oh, they also didn't have access to the Acts of Pilate in order to corroborate what the Acts of Pilate said. My guess is that the Acts of Pilate was written in one time, and then sometime after that, they wrote about the Acts of Pilate. So they don't have to know each other in order to know the Acts of Pilate. So, I mean, I just, you still have a long way to go in order to establish that they are corroborating the information that's in this Acts of Pilate.
Well, they quoted from it too. They didn't just mention it existed. They quoted from it.
Okay, that doesn't affect anything that I said.
You got to understand corroborating sources. You have to have these different independent guys are saying the same thing, quoting from the same thing, coming to the same conclusion. That's how we make historical arguments. You can't just dismiss them because you don't like them. You have to accept corroborating.
Is that what I said? Is that what I said, Stephen? Did I say that I don't like them, so I dismiss them? Is that what I literally said?
You just dismissed them because you didn't agree with what they were saying. However you want to word that.
No, that's not what I said.
Just wave them off. They're independent sources.
That's not what I said. In fact, what I said was that you cannot separate them from the Acts of Pilate itself. That Acts of Pilate was written first, and then sometime later they wrote all of their stuff, but it was still all based off of what the Acts of Pilate said. So until you can establish that they were writing independently of the Acts of Pilate, or maybe at the same time as the Acts of Pilate, then until you can prove that, then you really don't have a case for saying that the Acts of Pilate is historical. That's how real historiography is done.
No, well, I would argue against that. In fact, we have no history with that, because then we have no corroborating of anything. We know nothing about anything if that's how it's done. You have to corroborate through independent sources.
Okay.
All right, let's jump to the next question. Eric?
All right, so the next question would be to you, John, again. Is if the Gospels were created after 70 AD, can you actually cite ancient documentation to support an actual author for these documents, and how are they distributed, or how were they distributed, excuse me?
Okay, well, I mean, as far as like if there were actual authors that wrote them, I don't know who else writes things down other than authors. So I'm not exactly sure what you're expecting me to say here. I don't know who wrote the Gospels. I don't know who wrote Mark. I mean, other than just ambiguous, gospel authors that we will probably never know as far as how they were distributed. Each gospel was written for a respective religious community of Christians, and these Christians had different ideas about what happened during the life of Jesus. So each community wrote different things down that happened to Jesus while he was supposedly on earth. And so how were they distributed? Well, Christians just in general grew in number, and they passed around these gospels. There were actually many, many more gospels that were in circulation, but they were snuffed out by the eventual version of Christianity that came about, the Catholic type of Christianity that was the main Christian version of religion, the main version of the Christian religion, for thousands of years, or well, hundreds of years.
Dr. Boyce,
so the response to that is that the Mark, for example, if he is the first gospel account, which I think he is, and even Richard Bachman makes an argument about this in the eyewitness accounts. he deals with the fact that you have a comparison form of inclusio eyewitness accounts. It is corroborating and as well as independent in places. Luke would have been dependent on Mark, for example. Matthew would have been dependent on Mark if you hold to a Mark in priority, which I do. I know some don't. These guys would have been using, yes, each other's material, but there was a basis of source. And again, you have numerous people who were started by the churches at Rome, for example, whether you're talking about Peter starting a church or Paul starting a church, these churches had the documents that were being circulated, especially Paul's, by that point. And all of the earliest followers have attested to the fact that Mark was recording the works of Peter's sermons in Rome. It doesn't matter if you're talking about Papias, it doesn't matter if you're talking about Eusebius or Tertullian or Irenaeus, they're all saying the same thing, that he recorded eyewitness accounts of Peter in Rome. They distributed that. Remember, after Peter was martyred in Rome, John Mark went down into Egypt and he started churches in Egypt. The tradition of these churches, it's not that they rejected these other books while they were being compiled with these gospels they had. They were already quoting from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at the turn of the century. It can be shown in First Clement. It can be shown in the Didache. It can be shown in Ignatius's writings. They were only quoting four gospels. When other additional works came in with the apostles' names, they were rejecting because they were making, I mean, they tell you why. The churches were writing letters to each other. The North African churches were writing to the Roman church saying, we haven't received these. What are these books that are coming in with these names? These are the ones that we have collected from the apostles through their churches because they were started by church. These churches were started by the apostles. They're writing and they're like, no, we don't have those books either. They were rejecting them far before a Nicene council ever assembled. They were already fighting through these books. Like, these aren't the ones we received and passed down. They knew that when Marcion was corrupting the current ones that were out there of Paul's writings. They were very well aware of what text they had in their possession, and they were doing a lot of comparisons with them.
Next question. Tacitus, Josephus, and Justin Martyr, Ignatius, and then the Pilate inscription, etc., prove Pilate was a historical figure. Both are mentioned in the Passion. Why accept one historical figure and not the other?
Well, as far as Pilate goes, we have a lot more evidence of Pilate. The parts in Josephus that mention Pilate are not contested, like the parts that mention Pilate in reference to Jesus. And we also have the Pilate stone, which gives us physical evidence that Pilate was in existence at the time. And, you know, it's just the mountain of evidence for Pilate that shows that he was a historical figure, at least more likely than not.
And that's basically all the questions. Do you have any, Santi?
No, I don't have any. Let's see.
Any new ones?
Well, Instituto de Estudios Superiores was asking where did John get his degree, or I guess, I don't know, he didn't specify, so I guess it could be for both of them. And then I don't know if you guys want to answer that.
Well, I mean, I don't have a degree in history. I have 2 engineering degrees, a bachelor and a master's. And but I wouldn't classify myself as a historian, but all of my positions, points, and everything that's contained in my Crestus app are supported by scholarship, the accepted scholarship. So, I mean, all of my positions are backed by people that already know what they're talking about.
All right.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean he doesn't have to have a degree in history to speak about something. I mean, he's more than welcome to study the material as much as anybody else. And I think John works with Carrier on things at times, and Carrier's a good historian. I just had a discussion with Carrier the other day with Jonathan Sheffield. So again, you know, these getting into those kind of attacks are unnecessary. You know, let guys' work speak for themselves. I mean, I've done numerous debates with the top atheists as well as the top Muslims. We've written extensively, a lot of research. I would encourage anybody to read John. John, you have your own research put on the internet, I believe, video and written. Is that not mistaken? So he's got written documents. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah. I mean, on my website, I have some stuff written down, and my Crestus app is it's all backed by scholarship that I've read more than just Carrier, but Carrier is one of my main
Yeah.
sources and peer review for the
Yeah.
application.
So read all the work there. There's numerous stuff out there. I've actually turned a lot of my research in school to article form that's been given on citylightseattle.com. I think I just gave the right web address. A lot of my work was in the Gnostic Gospels, had really good opportunities, awesome opportunities to work with many of the librarians at the Smithsonian on Codex W, Washington Honest, which is one of the earliest gospel manuscripts with actual drawn pictures of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it's not in that order, actually. It's funny, the order is reversed. But it's an interesting gospel. Had a wonderful time working with a lot of the librarians there, working through these different manuscripts, as well as the one that's in Jerusalem. My dissertation was recently done on Codex H. I have released some of that material. Actually got to go on a couple shows and show some of the graphs that were done on the comparative form of the Greek text and structure. I would invite anybody, read John's stuff. I mean, go to his website, go to his app, go to his YouTube channel, watch his debates. I mean, this is what we need to do, is read each other's work. I have work out there as well. And I'm still taking a lot of that and putting it out into article form so that people don't want to get bored with just lack of information. But it's been fun. It's been a fun ride. And I know John's had fun studying stuff. We enjoy what we study.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate being able to have the debate tonight. Now, I would definitely suggest everybody going and reading Stephen's stuff and looking at what he's got. So I appreciate that, Stephen, but I also want to point everybody to read your stuff.
Appreciate that, John. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Boyce. I really appreciate the fact that you guys took time tonight to have this conversation. Both of you, I think, made some very good, compelling cases. And I really appreciate the fact that, you have been so flexible, especially you, John. We went back and forth and we had a little bit of things going on here and there. And you have been very graceful, and I'm very thankful for that. And to everyone in the chat, thank you so much for taking your time of being here as well. And I really appreciate it. If you guys found this debate helpful in any way, you can go ahead and share it. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, just go ahead and subscribe. If you didn't like it, you can put a thumb down. That's cool. And with that, I'll leave you all. Have a good night. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great